Guys, let's dive into some new polling giving President Biden a positive approval rating, strong marks of the 4 crises he's identified under his presidency: the coronavirus, climate change, racial injustice, and the economic downturn. In the latest Reuters Ipsos poll, 55% of Americans approve of the president's job in office, 40% disapprove. On his handling of the issues, 65% approve of Biden's handling of coronavirus, 29% disapprove. On the environment, 54% approve, 33% disapprove. On racial inequality, 51% approve, 37% disapprove. On the economy, 52% approve, 39% disapprove. On gun violence, 46% of Americans approve of the president's performance, 44% disapprove. And on immigration, the place where he is upside down, 42% approve, while 48% disapprove. Doris, I want to start with you. That's a lot of numbers to absorb, but on this 100-day mark of Joe Biden's presidency, there have been some comparisons to FDR and the New Deal. Obviously not perfect comparisons, but just in terms of the ambition, in terms of the money being sent out the door by the federal government. Is there something there as you look at those two administrations?
Yeah, I think the good reason why FDR has come into the conversation is that FDR made government a central figure in the Depression. Before that, there'd been an absence of leadership. He came in and said, I'm going to take action, I'm going to take responsibility, and you will see the government in a new role. And the country loved that. There were headlines in the newspaper, the government still lives, we have a leader. And I think what happened is that consensus about the importance of government lasted until Ronald Reagan in 1981, when he went before a joint session of Congress, just as Biden did the other night, and he said government is the problem, not the solution, and called for massive tax cuts and massive cuts in federal spending. And then you had his consensus going on really for another 4 decades. And conservatives he became a transformational leader. And now you've got Mr. Biden back again, calling for government as a central player to make the economy move from the ground up rather than trickle-down theory from the top down. So I think going back to what FDR was doing, we have cycles in American history, and those figures that you see, those popularity figures, are not simply for President Biden, but for the action of government. So if you can get trust in government again and move it along, then that will be an important power source for him to move forward on what he wants to do.
Yeah, Mike Barnicle, Joe's been talking about that a lot this week, that really that speech the other night, the address to the joint session of Congress by President Biden, marked the end of the 40-year Reagan era, where at his first inaugural in 1981, he said that government is not the solution, government is the problem. Joe Biden making just the opposite case the other night.
Yes, he did, Willie, and he did it in a normal way. I mean, it wasn't a big rhetorical flourish. It was just an ordinary human being who happens to be President of the United States addressing the nation. And Doris, in the address the other evening, throughout the address, the language, the body movements, the emotion that he showed, it struck me that there are similarities. There might be a similarity. You're much more in tune, obviously, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt than any of us are. But there might be a similarity between Joe Biden and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the sense that both were underrated, I think, coming into office. And both were looked at by the political powers that be, both in the late 20s and early 30s, and in Joe Biden's case for the last maybe 30 or 40 years, as you know, oh, that's just Joe being Joe. You know, he always wants to be president, but now he is president of the United States. And I sense from looking at him that he's always in a well-tailored suit. The suits look great on him, but the suits don't hide the chip that he might still have on his shoulder for the way he was treated when he was in the United States Senate, people snickering behind his back, and the way he felt, actually. Yeah, I didn't go to Harvard or Yale. He'd say that to people. And so now today, fast forward to the fact that he's president of the United States. And at the end of the day today, as a matter of fact, when he's in Philadelphia celebrating, hopefully, the renewal of Amtrak and the rebuilding of Amtrak, he goes to Wilmington for the weekend, his home. He goes home quite often as president of the United States. And it strikes me that when he goes home to be grounded. He goes home to continue the sense of normalcy that he values. And he views what we're going through as a country as 14 months of pain, misery, dislocation, all of it, fracturing the economy and fracturing some families as well. And his idea isn't liberal or progressive. I don't think he's thinking of it that way. I think he might be thinking of it, what he wants to do, what he plans to do, as a common sense application of government to help people, much the way Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in 1933 or 34. Do you agree?
I agree completely, Mike. I mean, you said a whole bunch of things I agree with. I mean, to a certain extent, I think his conversational style of speaking resembles the fireside chats. He's talking intimately to the people. He's telling them how these laws will affect their daily lives. You know, that's where coming from Scranton and remembering what happened to his mom and his dad really becomes important. I think on a temperamental basis, what he shares is the humility and the empathy that came in Roosevelt's case from polio, and the need to combat the idea that he had become paralyzed from the waist down in one day and had to build his body back up. And he suddenly became more connected to other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand. How true for President Biden because of what he suffered in his life. And the resilience that it takes to come through those experiences, I think they both shared. But I love what you said about that chip on the shoulder, because Lyndon Johnson's father used to tell him, you know, if you brush up against the grindstone of life, you'll get more polish than you'll ever get by going to a Harvard or a Yale. Because LBJ had that same sense of having gone to San Marcos State Teachers College. And what matter is it? What matters is what's in your head, in your heart, you know, your intuition, your empathy, humility. These other leadership qualities are more important than the label that you get by going to one of those schools.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.